It was not the sound of gunfire, nor the waving of flags on a ship's deck. Yamamoto Isoroku entered history through the silence of a man who knew all too well that victory is never eternal. He did not appear as a hero riding the waves, but as a keeper of balance, striving to delay the inevitable war. And when the final moment forced him to choose, not for glory, nor out of hatred, he chose to go first, so that, perhaps, others might be the ones to survive in the end.
The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes, or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article.
The Snow Winds of Nagaoka. In Nagaoka, winter came early and lingered long. The wind swept across the barren fields, slipping through the wooden cracks of the small house where the Yamamoto family lived. In that skin-biting cold, 6 children huddled around the hearth, none of them speaking much, for both the chill and the poverty made people sparing with words. Isoroku was the youngest. A skinny boy, his limbs scratched from climbing rocky hills, with eyes that always looked farther than the other children's. His mother, a quiet woman with rough hands worn from mending clothes through the long, snowy months, never hugged her children when they cried. She would simply cook a little more porridge, place it on the wooden table, and turn away, leaving behind the only warmth she had to give. His father was a samurai with no land, no troops. He taught his children Chinese characters, taught them how to bow before the powerful without losing honor, and most importantly, how to endure. War doesn't start with swords, but with poverty, he once said, handing Isoroku his first wooden sword. One winter afternoon, the news arrived that his eldest brother had died in Manchuria. Isoroku did not cry. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the wind whip his face, his hand still clutching that worn wooden sword. In that moment, perhaps something froze inside the 10-year-old boy. Not from grief, but because, for the first time, he understood. Survival is a kind of discipline, too. Later in life, people would speak of Yamamoto as a proud admiral, a cold strategist. But in that silence, perhaps the wind of Nagaoka still whispered, along with the image of a mother quietly sewing by the ashes of a dying fire. From frozen dust to roaring waves. When he came of age, Isoroku left Nagaoka, carrying with him nothing but a name, a few worn garments, and the silence that had seeped into him since childhood. Japan, by then, was stirring into a new shape. Iron trains shrieked across once quiet fields, Western uniforms replaced ancient armor, and a new generation stood torn between two shores. On one side, the solemn rites of their ancestors. On the other, the mechanical discipline of a changing world. Isoroku chose the Navy, not out of dreams of glory, nor a love for the sea. Perhaps it was because he knew, in a storm of change, only those who learn to steer can keep from being drowned. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima was unlike anything he had ever known. There, every mistake was punished with precision. Every individual was expected to melt into the steel rhythm of discipline. But amid the barked orders and sharp whistles, Yamamoto stood out, not for strength, but for patience. While his classmates struggled with French and German, Isoroku spent his nights learning English. Someone once asked him why. He simply replied, "Because tomorrow, we may have to speak to them." through words or through guns. His instructors called him the silent one who listens. His peers knew him as a cool head in a slender frame. But few realized that in every step Yamamoto took was the echo of that same boy who once stood motionless in the snow-laced wind of Nagaoka. A boy who had learned that survival is an art, and that understanding one's enemy can sometimes matter more than hating them. A stranger between two worlds. In 1990, while Japan still basked in the triumph of the Great War, Yamamoto Isoroku was sent to the United States. It wasn't merely a study mission. It was a journey across ideological frontiers. From a nation just learning how to build an empire, he stepped into the heart of one already shaping the century to come. At Harvard, surrounded by red brick buildings and the buzzing air of open discourse, he found none of the silent obedience he'd known at Etajima. There, people stood up, questioned history, even debated the sacred. Isoroku didn't belong, but he wasn't out of place either. He took notes on everything: economic strategies, the pulse of industry, the psychology of a restless people, the anatomy of a society that seemed chaotic yet enduring. It was as if he were preparing for a war without gunfire. And there, in that strange land, he discovered something Japan had never taught him. That power wasn't measured solely by battleships, but also by belief. He admired America, not as a friend, but as a formidable rival. "I've seen them," he once said. "Every factory, every man, every dream. If war comes, we must strike at that heart, or not touch it at all." To Americans, he was the courteous officer. To some Japanese, he was the weakling who'd inhaled too much of the West. But Isoroku knew the war that loomed ahead would be unlike anything Japan had ever faced, and the one who lit its fuse could not afford blind pride. When he returned, the winds had shifted. In boardrooms and on front pages, people now spoke of living space, of Asia's divine destiny, of ancient glories to be resurrected with steel and fire. Yamamoto, the quiet admiral whose eyes had seen America from within, found himself out of step. He opposed war with the US, not out of cowardice, but because he knew the enemy. In closed meetings, he was blunt. "If you begin this war, I can create havoc for a year, maybe 2. But if America still has the will, then the 3rd year will be the beginning of our end." To the militarists, he was a pessimist, perhaps even a traitor. But Yamamoto didn't argue. He wasn't a politician. He was a soldier. And when the order came, he bowed, just as he always had. So he drew up the plan for Pearl Harbor, a daring, precise strike, not because he believed in it, but because he held a faint hope that it might end the war before the American tide could rise in full. On the eve of the attack, he wrote to a friend, "I hope I'm wrong. I hope the faith I have in America is just a mistake." Perhaps no strategist ever launched a war hoping it wouldn't come. But Yamamoto Isoroku did not fight to win. He fought for the honor of a soldier who could not abandon his post once the storm had begun to howl. Pearl Harbor, a blow without celebration. In the winter of 1941, Yamamoto stood over a map of the Hawaiian Islands spread across the war table. Everything was in place like a chess game opened with a blazing gambit. 6 aircraft carriers, more than 300 planes, would slice across the Pacific like a blade striking at the heart of America. No declaration of war, no warning. But he did not smile. The plan was his, drawn with painstaking precision. Yet it was not designed for glorious victory, but to inflict damage swiftly, deeply, hoping it would shock the enemy into hesitation, into negotiation. It was a gamble at sea, paid for with the lives of young pilots and the honor of an entire nation. On the night before departure, Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin. Outside, the warships groaned in the fog. He wrote a few short lines in his journal. "The war will begin, not because we wish it, but because no one can stop it. I do not know if the Americans will forgive, but I know no one here will ever forget tomorrow." On December 7th, cold winds swept across the Pacific. And then, like thunder from a clear sky, the Zero fighters dove down on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Sailors died in their sleep. The world reeled in disbelief. In Tokyo, the people cheered, flags waved. The radio proclaimed a glorious triumph. But Yamamoto remained silent, offering no congratulations. In his eyes, it was not a victory. It was the beginning of the very disaster he had tried to prevent. He whispered to his subordinates, "If America truly awakens, we have awakened a sleeping giant." The darkness behind the halo, Midway, the Solomons, and the wandering footsteps. After Pearl Harbor, no victory could ease the unease in Yamamoto Isoroku's heart. He had shaken the world, but in return had unleashed a game that spiraled beyond calculation. War was no longer something he led. It was something that swept him along, like an invisible flood. The Battle of Midway, where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sank deep into the flaming sea, was the decisive moment. Yamamoto, once a meticulous planner of every line of attack, had to watch his strategy collapse in less than a day. It was not only a strategic defeat, but also the first tolling bell that Japan was now fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy not only strong in firepower, but unyielding in will. From Midway onward, Yamamoto retreated into the shadows of his own mind. In the Solomon Islands, where even the waves carried blood and sweat, he quietly observed battles that increasingly felt meaningless. Guadalcanal, a barren land torn apart by bombs, left a wound in his soul that never healed. The young soldiers, the sunken, nameless ships, each loss became a cut in the heart of a man who once believed that war could be governed by reason. He no longer believed in victory, yet he fulfilled his duty as an admiral, not out of hope, but out of honor. In the night, beneath the dim glow of operational maps, he once whispered to himself, "If I am not here, who will stop them from taking one more step toward the abyss?" He did not try to justify, nor did he object, for to Yamamoto, dying because of a mistake was still more honorable than surviving through silence. Beneath the crisp military uniform, within the sharp tone of his commands, was a soul already drained, not by defeat, but by the realization that this war had long since exceeded everything he was taught, believed in, or hoped for. And where the unending waves of offensives continued to erupt, he, the man who entered this game with faith in order and logic, was now merely a solitary figure aboard a ship speeding toward the abyss. Death in the Blue Sky. Operation Vengeance. In the spring of 1943, as the intoxication of Japan's early victories was beginning to fade, the Americans finally received the gift they had long awaited since Pearl Harbor: the exact coordinates of Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku's flight. A broken code, seemingly harmless, just an itinerary announcing an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands, became a preordained ending. No one but Yamamoto himself knew that he was flying into a death trap, and the Americans, upon receiving the information, did not hesitate. The order from Washington was kept top secret under the code name Operation Vengeance. On April 18th, the sky over Bougainville was clear and blue, without a single cloud. A formation of P-38 Lightning aircraft took off from Guadalcanal, carrying out an unprecedented mission to assassinate a supreme commander in the middle of a war zone, thousands of nautical miles from home. They flew low, hugging the ocean's surface, gliding silently like hawks beneath radar range. And then, at exactly 9:34 a.m., they struck. The Mitsubishi G4M, Betty bomber carrying Yamamoto, was surrounded. There was no escape. Bullets tore through the fuselage, and in that brief moment, the man who had ignited the Pacific War fell toward the blue sea without a final word. When his body was recovered, he was still seated, hand clutching his sword, as if he had never left the post of a commander. No panic, no attempt to flee. A calmness so cold, it felt like his nature from the very beginning. News of Yamamoto's death was kept secret for several days. To Japan, he was the last symbol of reason amid the madness. To the soldiers under his command, his death was a moment that made the wind stop blowing in the cockpit, that stripped the war maps of their final pillar. And to the Americans, the pilots who carried out the mission, there was no feeling of victory, only a mission completed. An ending for the one man who had understood them better than anyone else in Japan. Yamamoto departed as he had lived, beneath the open sky, alone, and with calculated precision. No fanfare, no spectacle. Yet in the hearts of those who knew him, ally or enemy, his death carried a quiet sorrow that words could not quite capture. For whether friend or foe, all understood that within Yamamoto Isoroku, there was something that transcended borders, ranks, and victory itself. He was not merely an admiral. He was the last witness to a dream of a Japan that might have triumphed through intellect, not blood.
Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.